episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. Zach here, as always, and with me is Matt. How's it going, Matt?
Oh, man, I'm exhausted. It's Friday. It's been driving every day. I'm like a road warrior as of late.
Tell our dedicated listeners how many miles you drove this week in the great state of Indiana and whatever other states you went to.
Jeez, I think I'm over 2,000 miles.
Yes.
From Monday through Friday.
Yeah, that new job's, it's pushing you.
But you know what? I wake up every day with a smile on my face. So
yes,
can't beat that one.
All well and good. Yeah, so we're gonna do a brief. I think we're okay with a brief update because it really hasn't been that long since we recorded last. But in that interim, I went and I just decided to get COVID over that little bit of break. So I am part of the mass infected. But since I let science guide my decision-making processes, I had all 3 shots. So for me, COVID amounted to a head cold. And I didn't even really know I had COVID until all the students around me were popping positive. And I was asking them, what are your symptoms? And they were like, I just have a head cold. I was like, crap. So I did the responsible thing. Went and took an at-home test. It said negative. Didn't believe it because of the damn head cold. Got a PCR test, and sure enough, it was positive. I was supposed to be in the field last week, and the idea of being in confined small vans with other not with other students, with my students, and possibly getting them sick was not cool. So I'm happy I did that. But the only symptom that I got was the brain fog, which is real, and I don't think it should be referred to as a brain fog. I feel like COVID's almost like that fungus cordyceps that like takes over the brain of its host and makes it do things. And one of the ways that I knew I had COVID, I was sitting here at the desk. I'm at school recording this, and I'm the chair of my department. So first week of school, I have 5 million things I've got to do. And I was reading the list, and I literally was thinking, yeah, I'm just not doing that. I'm not going to do that either. I think I'm going to go eat a cookie. That's the way my brain was working, and that is not like me, and that's what led me to think, all right, something's wrong. And that getting motivated, I'm a very motivated, energetic guy, but strangely, I think I'm the only person that may have benefited from COVID because it chilled my ass out, and I've been living a nice life since, so there's the not to make this political or go any route like that, but if you wanted a reason to get all 3 shots, I got the disease that's wiping out our species, and I came out of it feeling literally good. So that happened. Brumation, full swing. It's getting real cold here, dropping down to 4, 3. I think we're at -1 soon. So this morning I woke up. Thank God for Govies. I saw I'm okay with them getting down to 45. When they get to 40, I'm like, eh. When I saw 37 on the Govee, I was like, oh, crap. So got down there and moved everybody to the middle of the garage, and they're all fine. So there's proof that you can't just do the brumation thing and forget about them, because I'd have a bunch of dead snakes. I'm pretty sure we're going to drop low freezing in that corner of the garage, the infamous corner. So that's that. And then the big thing, because I keep doing this at the end, and I need to do it at the beginning. So I mean this when I say this, listeners. If you are a fresh college graduate, I am looking for a student for the herpetoculture lab. I've got a lot of ideas. We have the funding to see those ideas to fruition. We may talk about an idea or 2 tonight. So if you're interested in that, and that's something you want to do, get your master's degree with a herpetology slant in herpetoculture, I'm totally game. I'm looking for a solid student. So reach out to me. Lots of people do. Don't be shy. We're all snake nerds. I'm a snake nerd. If you've listened to the podcast, Matt and I are snake nerds. That's I think we're the only podcast that talked about hormone cascades, for Christ's sake. So anyway, so that's what's up with me. Matt, besides driving all over the Midwest, what's up in your world?
You know what? Quite the opposite in terms of brumation here. I mean, in Indiana, our temperatures are jumping all over the place. Mm-hmm. I mean, this past week, we've had 45 degrees. Today it was in the 30s. So it's kind of interesting in terms of respect to how this winter season is going.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've often talked about and things of that nature were light cycles, feeding, as well as temperature in terms of dropping. And, over the past couple of years, I've only really been able to get the animals down to about 58 degrees and hold them constant for about 3 months. And I've had very good success using that methodology. But, the way that weather patterns are working right now, it's kind of like Indiana is being held outside of that Arctic bliss, if you will. I mean, left or right of us and south, it's like winter wonderland. But no, all joking aside, I mean, most of the stuff is down for the winter, and just kind of enjoying and playing a little bit of catch up and trying to plan some projects in terms of respectively what my focus is going to be in the next couple of years, and try to redirect some of that focus for selectively breeding some different traits this upcoming year to bring out some of the different colorations and just patterns of some of the animals, but also thinking long-term, project-wise, which animals I'm going to continue to pursue and which animals I may start to reduce off in numbers, especially for my long-term goal of breeding every species of Elaphid before I die, but hopefully not a COVID.
Yeah. Well, we don't want that to happen. I'd have to find a new co-host, man. That would suck.
Yeah.
Plus, we want you to live for other reasons as well. So anyway, okay. Well, that all sounds well and good. It's kind of weird that you're not getting blasted with the cold weather, because over here in West Virginia in the Mid-Atlantic, we're just getting slammed. We had, Christmas to New Year's was basically spring, and now we're actually below average now. It's nuts. We're talking like quite literally 70-degree spread in 2 months, which is nuts for us anyway. Okay, so are we ready to jump in?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so our guest tonight needs no introduction. I've heard him referred to as the NPR Network historian. I think that's a pretty good title. He knows all things, so herpetoculture, and we're freaking excited and pumped to have him with us tonight. So we have Rob Stone with us tonight. Lots of people hear Rob talk about rhino rats. We have every intention of having a rhino rat episode with Rob on it, but we thought we would shake things up and talk to Rob about another colubrid that he has ample experience with that definitely has a following. Matt loves them to death. I have a couple of them myself, and that is the bamboo rat. So Oreocryptophis I can never say the species name. Porphyracea. There, I think I got it out. So how are you?
I'm
Mr.
excellent.
Stone?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to talk about porphies. Yeah, they're certainly awesome snakes. Matt's doing the Lord's work at this point, and so I'll just help him out a little bit, trying to remember some of the details, and because I know he'll be doing the same for me.
Excellent. So before we jump into the porphy talk, you've been on several podcasts, and we talked about this before the episode was on tonight, that we don't necessarily need to spend time on the Bob Rock introduction to herpetoculture piece, because that's been on NPR and THP and other places. So I wanted to spend more time just talking herpetoculture, all that jazz. And one of the questions that we always ask people is, what about colubrids makes you a colubrid keeper? So I know that you have a diverse collection. If you would, you've kept boas, you've kept pythons, you've kept lizards, all that jazz. But when it comes to colubrids, what about colubrids do you like? What do they bring to your herpetoculture table?
I think I really like the diverse, obvious, same as a lot of people are going to say, the diversity, but also kind of inherent maybe in that diversity is actually flexibility, right? So some of the diversity implies that they're in unique environments or they're responding to particular stimuli in those environments. But I think also for the most part, especially, they sort of have broader baseline parameters, I think, than a lot of boas and pythons that have a much narrower range of acceptable conditions, so that you can feed them a lot or you can feed them a lot. You can do a heavy food cycling situation that can involve feeding them every day for 2 or 3 months of the year, and then effectively or actually not feeding them the entire rest of the year. Or they have the capacity to be the classic single pet reptile that gets fed one defrost mouse every week and eats the whole year through, even feed charging on through the winter changes and everything else that's going on, getting those inputs, and they just keep on plowing ahead. So I think those are kind of the two things that really appeal to me. Obviously, there's a whole host of different ones, and that implies adaptation to different things, and that makes them special. But they're also just so generally so willing to engage. And then when you're talking diurnal one, which is probably most of them being diurnal, they tend to make really great displays and be super interactive to you too. If you walk in the room, whether it's a garter snake, an indigo, a rhino, whatever it's going to be, that they're really reactive to you coming in. They're looking at you. Hopefully it's a downer on the Ptyas because it just means that that's their warning signal and they're going to hide away. So those are kind of a bummer to me. But on an indigo, conversely, or a rhino, it means you coming in, they'll see you barely coming in, and that's a stimulus to actually come out and see if they can get some food off you or otherwise get an interaction.
Yeah, I think that Matt and I, the interaction aspect's definitely part of it for us as well. So, no, very, very cool. So, just to kind of give some background, because I love your collection. I haven't seen it yet. Love to see it. But could you kind of explain the process that you undergo at this point in your herpetocultural career? What does an animal have? What's your process in deciding what makes it into the room? Like, is it just an impulsive thing, or do you have there's knowledge, then there's wisdom, and you get wisdom through experience? Like how do you have Candoya, and then the Colubroid, or I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the Jamaican boas, I think, is what you have, right? And then Rhino, it's not eclectic, it's just badass. So how did you make that decision to have those particular species?
I think a lot of it, and it's actually, it's funny to some extent. I think people, there's a bad reputation in herpetoculture, just, as with anything in life, of people saying, oh, you're jumping into and out of things, or I think where that negativity usually comes from is people, getting into something and being really excited about it for a week or 2 weeks or a month, and then hopping out of it, as opposed to with the view that I would advance to people that are just trying stuff. Or maybe, I think we're seeing part of the Colubrid explosion, right? As people moving from came in with a fixed idea of, I'm going to keep this one thing, kind of to, in a way that didn't happen even 20 or 25 years ago, where just we would absorb all the content we would get. So you get Reptiles magazine or Vivarium magazine, and you're looking at that, and they're not focused on a single item. What comes to mind is ball pythons, maybe you could make an argument about corn snakes, boas, true boas, that sort of stuff. I would advise folks to try a ton of different things. Just don't run your mouth about how the best thing is the thing you've had for a week. You could try stuff, see how it goes. And there will be things that work well for you. Essentially, we talk about, Eric and I joke about things in the context of saying, oh, those things suck. Well, they don't suck, but they suck relative to my expectations and my desires. But you kind of have to try different things and come to learn both the truth of those animals and the truth of yourself. So you need to try different things. So most of the stuff that I have now, if not all the things that I have now, are things that I've had before, and when I had many more things, or had before and got rid of, save for the Puerto Rican boas and the Jamaican boas. I wanted those from the first Reptiles magazine I ever read, maybe the second. So the second non-annual Reptiles magazine I read was the April or so 1998 Reptiles, and Puerto Rican boas were in there as something that wasn't entirely unavailable, right there. CITES 1, ESA, endangered, entirely unavailable, but it was someone in Puerto Rico just talking about them as the boas, more or less, that exist in their environs. And so from that moment forward, those were something that I thought, man, someday I'd love to get the opportunity to work with those. And it turns out there are people, you can't sell them. It's all a gift situation. There's no reciprocity. There's no nothing, it's just, it became something that was like, wow, if I ever get the opportunity to work with those, I'd really like to. And it turns out they're awesome, at least relative to what I like. I don't, and maybe some of the Colubrid stuff is like this too, where I don't mind getting musked. It's not that I'm seeking it out, but it's not. I know some people it's really a problem, whereas for me it's not really a problem. I love Nerodia. I love garter snakes. The episode you guys did with Rob Shea was fantastic. Was really excited about that.
Yes.
So that's sort of to my taste. And Jamaican boas are similarly, I guess certainly they're related-ish. They're not as close as we once thought based on their, the physiology suggests something more than the DNA actually suggests. But those are just amazing. They all look calico with all these different colors, and they're beautiful. But as captive animals to keep, Jamaican boas, they're these pretty beautiful snakes, right? But they're generally kind of fussy feeders. They're far more likely to musk. They're not very likely to bite you, but they're pretty likely to musk you. And people, the general population is like, man, those are the best. But no, to me, the Puerto Rican boas are the best. I get it that they're just somewhere between a brown to a light brown to purple, have some yellows to completely black, but a very iridescent, beautiful black coloration. But I tell you what, those things, that's a snake that stands up for itself and engages in nightly hunting behavior just the way it does in front of caves. If you have those set up in cages, they'll hang down just looking for a small meal. They like that small stuff just to mimic, seemingly to mimic eating bats in the wild. They're just bad, they're just bad. If you see them at night, they're actually not as bad as you would think. But if you wake them up during the day, if they're going to bite you anywhere, they're going to take a shot for your eyes because they're looking at you and they're paying attention and they'll give you a shot. But I respect the hell out of that. Those to me are just so cool, and those are a little bit of an exception. Rhinos, it's same thing. We'll get into the Porphy stuff. Same as everybody was seeing those from the mid 90s with Klaus's stuff, and then Pro Exotics was hot and heavy, with those. I bought the Rhino collection from Pro Exotics when they moved on from them in early 2003, something like that. Tom and I bought all of those animals that they had at that time, and that's the only thing that I've had continually ever since that time. So there's things that have come and gone, and then the Candoia, I'd never had them before, but maybe 7 or so. Then they were gone. Right, this is one of they weren't available, and then in the early 90s they were imported by an amazing truckload, considering that they come from these 2 small islands in the Solomon Island chain, but literally thousands were imported over, 1,000 a year for 4 or 5 years, and then there weren't any more. They sort of came back available for the first time in at least a decade. Cameron had some, and I got some of those animals just because, again, that was the thing that I had missed the window of when they were available. So it was just, hey, let's try these. These are something that's talked about, not necessarily valued, but talked about. And I've had those since then. They turned out to be really cool and really responsive. And kind of in the same way, people say, oh, they're so tame. I tell you what, reach in there at night under a red bulb when they're in a feeding season, and that's a very powerful snake that is quite willing to give you a bite. And you won't forget, I've been bit twice, over 7 or 8 years or whatever. I've been bit twice, and they're really strong. They look kind of diminutive and frail, but they're really strong, and they got some heavily recurved teeth. But it's funny because to me, that's what, I guess we've gone all over the map here. I apologize for that, but the reaction, the reaction would be that, all of them have different appeals to me. And while I recognize they all have things that might make them more or less of a challenge and might make them a good or a bad fit for someone else, there isn't one perfect fit. They all have at least one thing that really appeals to me, all the stuff that I have right now. And many of them have, it's really, if you looked at it on balance, you'd say, wow, most of the things that they do that are peculiar to them are appealing or fit into the way that I'm enjoying keeping stuff at this point.
Well, and that I think brings up the next thing. I mean, because you've kept these animals in a variety of different situations and setups. I mean, what's the current means of keeping in your collection?
Yeah, 100%. I've moved, well, and I think this is another natural thing, and maybe even more so for folks that are kind of in our window or more recent, is that I'm of the time when a lot of the glamour or significance was given to people who were producing stuff, and kind of have big collections and have all these different things, and a commercial aspect to it. But whether Bob Applegate and he was, to me, even he doesn't really fit in that box because he was so just his positivist attitude about a whole host of different things, and but from and doing it a different way, right? Not doing it in racks, but rather the quote Applegate style enclosures, very similar to some of the European design, but with the modularity to the bottom and given different accesses. I think I've gone through cycles of having a lot of animals, and sometimes that's a lot to keep and produce from. Sometimes it's a lot to have as turning over, getting stuff principally from Cameron. Just being local to him, particularly at the time when he was bringing in a lot of stuff, just the opportunity to see a ton of different animals. But there's another box coming in 2 weeks, and to have the money to buy something in that box, something has to go. There has to be an in for the out, to have the money to do that. So went through some of that. At this point, that's not happening. I'm really happy with all the stuff I have, and honestly, I'm not sitting here pining to add something different. And so I'm really just trying to instead focus on really enjoying the stuff that I have. And so that means cages and trying to, so the room, all the cages have lights on or in them, depending on the setup. I do still have some that are in tubs just based on kind of where we're at status wise, and obviously on some of this stuff, if you're trying to participate effectively as a hobby SSP, if not, and to some extent actually involved in the SSP for some of those BOA things, it's kind of like, well, I can't send these things out, at least these particular ones, the Offspring, or different things. Okay, that makes sense, but you have to keep some number to it. But the room fixture is red bulbs, and I have the all the lights that are on the cages timed up, and this. Yeah, we'll come back to this, I'm sure, but sort of the Cosmic Octopus idea of whether we need to replicate and it wouldn't be possible, right? So I'm keeping Solomon Island critters. I have a couple carpet pythons. I have northern Mexican pine snake, the depi. I have rhinos. Let's see, Jamaican, Puerto Rican boas. So a lot of equatorial or within a certain range, right? Limitation. I guess there's some similarity there, but the point being that if your entire room has to mimic the conditions of a particular one, you're going to struggle in a way that if you figure out sort of baseline parameters that will work for all the things, you can then hammer the things where we have some flexibility. And I would argue that annual light cycles is one of those areas. Maybe humidity is to a lesser degree. Certainly temperature, there are base minimums, but heck, I know you guys know from field herping and just going out into nature that the impression that's been created, right, that things only survive within this very narrow band, that I think really is a function of people keeping boas and pythons, not keeping colubrids, has people way worried about lower temperatures, intermittent lower temperatures than they need to be.
Well, no, and Rob, even talking about this, I mean, in some of our side chats and things like that, even with some of the boas and pythons that I have here just for fun, I mean, I keep them a lot cooler than a number of people. And I think some of that even has to do with some of the means of people saying, no, we need care sheets. Yeah. Right. That's kind of that's like the minute someone brings up care sheet in a conversation with me about acquiring animals, that's pretty much like, whoa,
right.
This conversation has just ended.
Right. It's a warning to say there needs to be, right, an exchange of ideas to help you figure out what is permissible, a baseline permissible to what's happening. But yeah, you're not going to replicate all the peculiarities of your conditions, Matt. So there's no reason to. It would be disingenuous for you to say, oh, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and it's like, well, even your own situation isn't static relative to those conditions, probably, unless you're in a situation that you're not, in terms of, oh, I have this zoo facility that is maintaining this very rigid structure in a way that something, a non-commercial space or a space that's not solely invested for that purpose just won't do. And you'll be fascinated, people would be fascinated to see even, all that BOA stuff. My ambient temperatures will get down into the mid 60s, low 60s in the room, and have them off heat or reduced heat, so that maybe it's set at 73, running over the night. Certainly not something that people maybe would expect a feed on. And you'll go in there and all the boids are sitting there looking for a feed, where the colubrids are shut down and have no interest. And it's like, if you were to tell someone that you're doing this, I even maintained for a buddy a bunch of ball pythons. And what I saw in those animals was really fascinating in terms of there's so much more plastic relative to what they can handle and are willing to do than people give them credit for, even in the same way, right? So this is something that I think I always I've learned to try to not trivialize anything, right? Even the stuff that we think of as common, whether it's the pet bearded dragon at the school, right? You bring that home. I don't think I've ever had a bearded dragon of my own, actually. Amazingly enough, I've had all sorts of, fancy things. I don't think I've ever had a bearded. If you actually set it up in a way that promotes its natural behavior, that's awesome. Brown and Knowles are awesome if you actually set them up to foster them to do well, and watch the behaviors. They'll engage. As much as I say, on the one hand, all reptiles have some peculiarities that might make them suited or ill-suited for a given keeper, they also all have fascinating behaviors. It's just a question of whether they're ones that we can watch with the way that we want to keep our animals.
Well, and that kind of brings into a whole different facet here, I think, in terms of specialized keepers or colubrid keepers even too, or people that are looking for new species to keep, it's the intellectual curiosity and trying to watch the animal and adapt to that animal and provide those types of resources, whether it's documenting, at heart, bringing into context all the episodes that we've had up to today. I mean, we've always talked about, note keeping, watching, adjusting, and all of those respective parameters. And that's a big part of this that a lot of people don't take to heart.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and I would encourage people, actually. So I keep my entire collection on a single sheet that I enter into Excel, is maintained in Excel, and then I print it out and I write the notes, and then I re-enter that information. And it's not, into the sheet after sort of as it comes to me, but it's going to be after 3 or 4 or 5 entries. I don't do the Pro Exotic specified date. That turns into way too many cards for me. It's not necessary. Instead, I just have a blank, and then, okay, now there is an entry for January 20th. Okay, and I'll write that. And if there's anything pertinent for anything that I happen to see, I'll write it on there. And then it might be, rather than having it be just January as its own card, maybe it'll be January 26th before I happen to notice anything else that justifies adding another notation and doing this. And yeah, it's fantastic to be able to sit there, and I have on a single clipboard the entirety of the records associated with my room for the last going on 5 years in, right at my immediate disposal. Just flip through the pages there as to everything. And, it's really practical compared to, at least for someone whose collection isn't huge, and then maybe it turns into, well, this is the clipboard for this rack or for this room or for these types of animals or whatever it would be, as opposed to, again, I'm sure with you guys, I don't even know what systems you're using now, but whether it's each one has their own card, or there's a card for each set of things, each group of species, or whatever it might be. But that's what I've found And 100%, I've always been a note taker on that stuff, and it's critical and beautiful to be able to look at it and say, okay, this boa that I think is doing this thing, what did it do 3 years ago, the last time I observed this activity? And the other, actually, that prompts me. The other thing that's really helpful is having groups of things. So even though I'm sort of encouraging people to not have, maybe to have smaller collections and really enjoy them, if you have a bank of cages where you have 4 females of the same thing and you have an adjoining space, 4 or 5, 6 males, whatever it is, and you're able to engage with them and watch their behavior, and you say, that was the thing with the Solomon Island tree boas when the female produced 3 years ago, is I had 3 I did the same thing in terms of pairing them up and they'd all obviously gone through the same temperature variations, all the octopus tentacles, right? We'd run through all the same things. One of them acted differently to the other 3, and that wound up being the one that became gravid, ovulated, became, gravid, and produced offspring. I couldn't find anyone who could tell me what the actual distance between post-ovulation shed and parturition was. It turns out for me on that litter, it was 205 days. So there was 205 days of, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Just really attuning to it, saying, okay, there was the first month, she hit away on heat. Then she's sitting out, she's diurnal basking under a UVA bulb, while the other ones, this is not their normal behavior. And the other ones are all doing their normal behavior. And now she looks irregularly lumpy. Okay, this is probably, everything seems to be progressing, whatever. And you just kind of ride it out. But the fact that I had 4 of them that were in the exact same spot and I'd done the exact same things with, and I could look at it and say, well, 3 of you went back to doing what you normally do, and 1 is not. Certainly something's happening. Whether it be it's good, bad, or indifferent, something is going to happen here.
Well, and that's really curious too, because, just like many people when investigating a new species, they'll only pursue one pair.
Yeah.
And it's really not the best way to try to cultivate or start working with a new species that may be uncommon for your collection, and it becomes a numbers game at that point.
100%. And if anything at all goes wrong, then you're it's over.
Done.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So from that same perspective, I don't know. Go ahead.
What I do is if I think I'm going to get into a species, I will buy the 1 pair, and it's almost like I'm testing out the car. And I know that 1 pair does not equate to the whole taxa. And my 1 pair could be the 1 pair on planet Earth that's horrible. It could also be way cooler to keep than the average. But I will do that. And then basically, if I find myself nerding out and I'm seeking out more information and I'm gravitating towards that animal, that's my process of deciding, these are going to enter the collection. And when I reach that point where they're going to enter the collection, that's when the infamous herper hoarder thing kicks into gear. And it's like, all right, I have a pair. And then 1 month later, where did these 20 snakes come from? Like literally that's what happened. And what's really weird about me is that I'm at a weird point in my herpetoculture career, because I was hardcore into this stuff, but I was a keeper. I was not a breeder back around 99 through 2004 when I was in college. Then I went to grad school. Life happened, children, houses, job, and I was not in doing any of this stuff. I just had a pet, Florida king snake. And then when I got back into it, when it literally became my job, which 19-year-old me cannot believe that this is my job. But then I decided, okay, we're going to do this right. And in doing it right, I oftentimes, when I jump off that ledge and then the 40 whatever show up, I do this introspective thing, like, is this the right way? Do we need 40 of these? Because what you mentioned, Rob, the whole, the numbers game, and I know Matt and I both have substantial collections or manage substantial collections, but there are times when I think, what would it be like if I just pushed everyone aside and I just had 5.8 water cobras, false water cobras, and just did hardcore deep dive on this species. And I know my personality, I've got herpetocultural ADD, and that's not going to ever happen. But at the same time, would I become like the ultimate falsy keeper because I become so in tuned to all aspects of their care the way I am. But I also I like diversity, so it's kind of a weird dynamic.
I think
that's my perspective.
100%. I think the other thing that reminds me of, actually, in talking about, well, what makes a room mixture, or what, why do you have the collection you have, is actually that hits the nail on the head there, is that something is always happening. I have nocturnal snakes and I have diurnal snakes. I have things that are, super responsive to what you're doing. I have others that are less responsive that I like for other reasons. So, have lizards and have all these different things, so that there's always some stimuli at a given time, as opposed to if you just have a bunch of Australian pythons, then nothing is happening during the day. It makes a ton of sense to have Australian, goannas to have in the room too, because then you have, literally your own television program going on in the room. Because otherwise, even whether it's for your own enjoyment, right, and you have the ability to come enjoy it during the day, or maybe sometimes you do, right? There's a holiday or whatever it might be. There's something you can engage with during the day beyond having to take something out to do that, right? You can just sit there and enjoy it. I think that is a big part of it, is like actually fundamental diversity, so that you do get that experience of, I can walk in any time of the day and something is doing. I know, when I walk in, that a bunch of this stuff is not going to be doing anything, but hey, actually at this time, and even it's not so specific, right? Obviously, it's the middle of the day versus the middle of the night, but there's different things that are active right before and after, right before and right before in both contexts, right before the lights go on through just after, and then right before they go out and just after. There are things that are open, and engaging in things in the full middle of the day, and then there are things that are all night long. And I think that's an awesome thing to do. So liking enough things that you can have that is really fantastic. And heck, if you can put up with doing fruit flies, having dart frogs, dart frogs are fantastic. The bummer with them, right, is that is just the bug thing, in the sense that, to me, there's no Goldilocks for fruit flies. You always either have too many or not enough. It's really hard to do. You have to just always have too many and feel like it's a waste and it's not working, or you're going to come up short and it's going to be a problem. So if you can accept that reality in your life, then add some frogs, add some noise, get this stuff. And those require a beautiful display. Well, not necessarily a beautiful display, but a display, and kind of push you in that way and help you learn some of those skills as well.
Yeah. So you've mentioned it, and I think this is a good segue. The Cosmic Octopus. I hear you talk about the Cosmic Octopus all the time. And I always sit there and think, like, when you start going on the Cosmic Octopus discussion, you definitely have me hook, line, and sinker. I'm in it because I totally love this idea. I love this concept. I know Matt likes this idea. And I think with colubrid keeping, there's all kinds of tentacles from the Cosmic Octopus invading our world. And that's part of the reason why we like these snakes so much. But I'd like it, if you don't mind, to just kind of explain what you mean by the Cosmic Octopus. Like, why is it cosmic? And what are these tentacles doing? Like, what exactly is going on there when you make that statement?
Yeah, so to me, it's just an expression, really, of the idea of our own limitations and how that interplays with our interactions with the natural world. I think it's, there's a lot of hubris to the notion that we really understand a lot of what's going on. I think there are so many interconnected features in the world that are in, these interplay that are both in terms of regular items and then irregular. Heck, when we have volcanic eruptions, that's a huge disruptor event, right, to all sorts of natural processes that generally flow in a certain relatively predictable way, or way that we think we understand. And a lot of these things we do have, well, in general, human society, right, has knowledge of a lot of these different things. It's incredibly rare, if not impossible, for a single person to have a great depth of knowledge about all of the different things that are going on. And then I'm sure there are interactions that people aren't considering, just because it would literally, to my mind, the human brain isn't capable of understanding all the different complexities that exist in natural systems, particularly if you take sort of that cosmic view, right? If everything matters, if we're going from lunar cycles, so it's literally anything that's interacting in nature. And to me, it actually raises an interesting point that I know we think of the context of pollution, and this might sound strange, but the amazing part to me is how much we have polluted the earth and it still works. People talk about it in this I sort of have this reverse view of the situation. I'm just amazed. I'm continually impressed that all the abuse that's been, the earth has been subjected to a ton of abuse, and it still is work. You can point out, oh, well, actually we're seeing these changes, and all of that is certainly true. But the fact that it has undergone what it's undergone and it's still where it's at and still functional, to me, is amazing, and speaks really to interplays of different factors that, to me, it's just incredibly impressive. And I wouldn't suggest that I understand any real percentage of all the different interplays, right? We can look at these snakes and there are things, the triggers or light switches, however you want to think about it, of temperature, humidity, light cycling, even lunar cycling, to the extent that we have windows in our collections or they're perceiving it, humidity, ambient humidity, whether we're adding additional literal moisture, right, rather than even just the ambient humidity conditions that are changing based on time of year, which reflects then whether we're putting heat on or air conditioning, depending on where you are, what your resources are, how much we're feeding them, what prey burst looks like, what burst feeding looks like, what power feeding looks like, what we're putting into the rodents that are then being consumed by the snakes, whether we're adding additional vitamins and minerals into those prey items, whether they're being everyone. When I hear in general a conversation around rodents and feeding rodents, it's sort of there's a disdain for lab block that can't possibly be nutritionally complete relative to these things. And yeah, sure, I agree. The Cosmic Octopus suggests that's true, because there's, the rodents that they would be eating in this given place that won't be representative of what they're eating, let alone if we're talking about something that doesn't naturally eat rodents in the wild, or doesn't eat this species of rodents and maybe has a different body composition, different physiological composition. And that's before you even get into the body condition of the animals that you're feeding them. And are we feeding them things that we've defrosted in water so that the whole thing is hypersaturated with water, or are we feeding it sort of a dry jerky type thing that's having an effect to dry out the animals as they're going along? So to me, it's really just a reflection of what I don't know. It's kind of, when I talk about the Cosmic Octopus, it's me saying there's a ton. I'm recognizing recognizing all the unknowns that I have, things that I know, what they're known unknowns, things that I know that's a thing that exists that I don't know about, but I'm freely admitting that there are things that I don't know about, and I have no conception of. I don't even know that I don't know about them, but they're certainly happening, and they potentially could have an impact. And that, again, that's why I don't. Anytime someone would suggest that we're really trying to mimic something as opposed to trying to define metes and bounds and find operative conditions we can work in, I think that's a little bit misguided, because it just wouldn't be possible. So we have to define, okay, what are tolerable parameters, and then you have to have an open mind to try different things and say, okay, what happens if we give rodents eggshells that we're feeding out? Is that producing a differential impact? There's some sort of volcanic ash that people eat. I forget Matt, do you remember what this thing's called? It's something with an M.
Man. This stuff.
So we went through a period of time of putting this stuff into all these different things and saying, okay, what's happening here? Or you get the reptilinks. Interesting idea. It's not new, right? It goes back to, I even remember it from the T-Rex days from the mid-90s. Certainly there were plenty of ads associated with it. I'm sure it goes back even before that. I doubt that it's one of these that's like, well, this isn't a novel idea. It doesn't make a bad idea. It doesn't mean I don't support the company. What I took it to mean was, I'm going to get some of these elk and fruit mixture and feed them to some Lamprepeltis, and let's see what happens. What happens if, half of what they're eating, because if you picture it if they are eating a wild rodent that's gorged on, raspberries in the wild, like what's the impact of that? The hard part is that they're so rigid that you have to really kind of, and calorically dense, right? So that something, it's not, I'm going to feed it a link the size of a mouse, because that mouse has a ton of pliability that the link doesn't have. So you need to feed something, if you picture it as like, okay, what's this completely rigid item that it can swallow? Then it has to be willing to take it, which is, I found on Lamprepeltis stuff, about 40 to 50% would take them. Quite happily take them. The real small stuff, as you talked about, I think it was with Chad, you guys were talking through with Kathy Love, right, when she was on that.
Yeah.
The real small ones, they're kind of a mess. I think there's some minimum size where they're cased differently, and those are kind of a mess and a problem. But
so we had a little bit of a hiccup here, and we apologize about that. But Rob was going on this tangent and writing a philosophical journal article on keeping related to the Cosmic Octopus, and obviously the world as we knew it just imploded.
Yeah, it was a bit too much, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I think we were in the Reptilinks bit, and I guess just the suggestion to try and push boundaries and try different things and see how they go. Obviously, I'm not recommending that people, if you have an equatorial critter, that you go stick it in, a bunch of snow and see, hey, let's see what happens, right? That we know that there isn't the physiology to support that interaction, right? That isn't a possible thing that would happen, and that's gonna have negative consequences. But in terms of looking at something like, Reptilinks with fruit, well, maybe that replicates at least to me, I guess, by increasing the exposure you offer to things that don't seem outwardly deleterious, that you're probably increasing the likelihood that you're hitting factors that we're not even thinking about.
Yes. No, I agree with you 100% on this one. Zach obviously does too. And it's kind of interesting off of this is I had a friend that was a hunter, and every year he would take his excess deer sausage and actually pump it into small mice and then feed it to his breeder females, which I always found very interesting. But when you think about it in terms of the natural protein, and I mean, we look at this as a food cycle, right? Mm-hmm. And you start to think about what we're feeding mice as a whole and pumping in that deer meat into the rodent. I mean, we're providing even more nutrients than what we could have ever imagined.
Yeah. And then is that helping, or are we just causing hypervitaminosis, or is it totally irrelevant because the vitamins are things like vitamin C where you can't OD on it? You're just going to pee it out. But do they pee it out the same way a mammal pees it out because it's urates and it's not a liquid, it's a paste? Thinking this way, this is why I wanted to do the Cosmic Octopus talk, is that a lot of times I feel like we can get bored with our collection, and the way that we deal with the boredom is, I got to go get something new. And then you end up adding and adding and adding and adding and adding, and then you get to that overwhelm period of your herpetocultural career, which then leads to burnout, which then leads to I got to get out of here. And I one of the things that we promote with our podcast is just being, observing, taking it all in, and that being part of the process. And I think the Cosmic Octopus is what helps explain that approach to keeping. And it just, I'm not trying to be elitist in any way, just trying to change people's perspectives. And a snake you've had for 20 years, if you start asking questions about its current setup, how could I make it better? You don't do the care sheet cowboy approach. You actually maybe read a book about it, or you go onto iNaturalist and do what a lot of people do, and you find the places it is in nature, and then you go and follow it up with WeatherSpark, and you look at the weather there, and it just kind of engages you more, and it might make you think about the keeping more, and it might make you try something new. And if you try something new, it could work, it could not work. If it doesn't work and the animal's alive and it's none the worse for wear, then, you learn something. That's just part of this process. But this kind of keeping really, I think, makes herpetoculture so much more engaging, interesting, and most importantly, fun. And that's the way I like to keep. So, like, great example, I'm going to give him props. Justin Smith, this week, within the week, found out he had Gonosoma janseni eggs. And I'm very familiar with those janseni. And it's been fun watching Justin with those snakes. And he's a perfect example of this because I think when he got them initially, I don't know if they went right into a tub or they went in. When I say tub, I don't mean a rack tub. I mean tub with a Brahms specialty enclosure glass door kind of situation. But, he's a great example of what we're talking about here because he got the animals. And then first he had to figure out like how to get them to eat, how to get them established, how to keep them in their damn cage because they were, little escape artists. We'll throw that out there. Figured that out after he got them out of the closet a couple times. But, that's part of it. The Cosmic Octopus showed up and you got to outthink the snake, but you can't necessarily go at this like I'm an expert. So you get them established, there's growing. Then Justin decides, okay, I'm going to give them a lot of hides based off my observations. I'm going to give them all these plants. Don't have to be real plants, but I'm going to throw a pothos plant in there just for kicks. Watching them, he's in tune with the animals. And then if you listen to him on your episode with Snakes and Stogies, he realized, like, because he's a student of the serpent, he's watched the things. They're not acting the same way. You kind of have that fear response. Something's up. Goes in, but he spent enough time with them to know something's up. Lo and behold, there's eggs. And how did he get the eggs? He read and talked to people and discussed. I mean, I think he talked to you too, to be honest with you. But when you keep that way, it's so much more rewarding when things go right than when you just basically go, okay, 80-degree hotspot, Aspen, tub, water bowl, mouse every Saturday. Like, you're not, forget about talking about the animal welfare here. As a keeper, you're just denying yourself so much enjoyment if that's your strategy. And that's where taking the notes comes into play, all this kind of stuff. So, yes.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, one thing I've never really explored or talked about, and maybe this will be a future episode, is burnout. I mean, within relative keeping of colubrids and chasing the dragon, Chad started to talk about that, and I chased the dragon not with Asian rat snakes or anything of that matter, but this is going back probably 15 years now, and in terms of milk snakes, Hondurans, Nelsons, all kinds of stuff. And then I just realized, holy cow, I'm just not happy, and what am I doing? And and I really just went down the narrow-minded path of what we're going to talk about tonight with Rob, which is Porphyracea. And I started keeping and growing numbers relative of each one of those subspecies, if we really want to call them subspecies for this matter, until we actually really identify what's actually going on. But, I started to experiment with things. I started to play with different variables of that. And I don't have a good feel for it, but that was my passion and love for that.
Yeah.
So,
and that's a perfect segue to porphs, I think. So, any final thoughts on this, Rob?
No, I think it's fantastic. I think really that's it. It's just the humility to recognize what we don't know.
All right, sweet. So, Porphyracea. Matt obviously loves these snakes. I think Cock's Eye is in your logo for Serpamitra, correct?
Sure is. And it's in that painting up there, right?
Oh, nice. So, you were, Rob, you were at Pro Exotics, and you were part of the initiation or the first big wave of Porphies in North America. And then I believe you've kept them independent of that. But for people interested in bamboo rat snakes, do you mind just giving kind of your view of the history of them entering the hobby, how they got here, what the major like push was way back in the day. Like we talked about last week with Chad, how you had to buy a reverse trio at first, and the price tag was pretty up there. But like, what was your experience with initially getting into this wonderful group of snakes?
Yeah, 100%. My experience mimicked that of Chad. I think my impression, right, was that Klaus was the first to breed them, as you guys talked about. I had gotten the Lowy province animals and produced from them in probably 96 or so, 95 to 96, somewhere in that range. And he exported those through Cameron to the United States, and I believe those were the first. Well, there were probably Vianti here that hadn't done that well before, that would precede that, right? So wild Vianti had come in, I'd imagine, before that, but those would fit into the box of things that historically didn't do that well. And in general, right, they're a little more muted, particularly wild ones are more muted than Coxeye that were just these fire engine red with twin, racing stripe look, the real classic, the non-banded, the non-missing pattern look. And Klaus sent those to Cameron, and they went to principally Pro Exotics and then some zoos in the United States. And I think he probably sent them 3 or 4 years in a row. But the first ones that were sent, I believe, were 1998 model year.
Ah, okay. And so was Klaus breeding them from wild caught animals, and then the progeny were what we were given here in the States? Is that basically how this worked?
Yeah, 100%. As far as I'm aware, right, Matt? He had 4 or 5 original animals, I think.
Yeah, it was 5 original animals where all captive-born stock up to a couple years ago originated from, which is, when you think about the prolificity of these animals and how many clutches they lay a year and how many eggs they lay, you really start to wonder specifically on these animals. And, we talk about inbreeding, and people always are asking about getting unrelated pairs and things of that nature. No one ever knows. That's always been one of my aspects when conversing about things like that, is we just don't have enough of that information.
Yeah, 100%.
So the initial stock that Klaus has or acquired, obviously they're field collected. Do either of you, through your various conversations or interactions with him, did he ever talk about what it was like getting those animals from the wild established? Like, were they nightmares, or did they just take right to the captive environment? Like, this is these are animals that historically we don't keep warm. Was he in tune to that right off the bat, or was this one of those whole trial and error, cooking some Oreo Cryptophis to finally realize, room temperature, that's what we need to do? Like, how did those, that's the kind of stuff when it comes to these kind of conversations that I really like, the little nitty gritty details. So any idea on that?
Yeah, I think there was some familiarity. Certainly, what out of that original group, they all did pretty well. He did write an article in Soria on kind of the added, the process, the acclimation process, and initially getting that off the ground. And the funny bit is, you can actually see that one of the 5 wild ones that he got had the reduction in pattern trait. So where they start missing pattern along the neck, one of the wild animals pictured in that article has that trait. So you can see where the genesis of that trait in our population.
And just like any of these wild caught first time species, I think a lot of it is just monitoring the animals and adjusting accordingly. You start to learn a lot about the animal, and Klaus never really went into much detail off of keeping it. One of Klaus had sent me some pictures of his keeping style over the years and how he changed things. At one point in time, Klaus was producing hundreds, if not thousands, of colubrids a year. And he kind of changed that because he was going away from the box, if you will, of not only a rack system, but just having free flowing boxes throughout the room of just, resourceful, useful boxes. And his style changed more towards what we see in herpetoculture overseas, which is you're living with the animals, which I think is a very cool style, because he had terraria in an area on his walls with couches in the middle, so he could sit in his chairs and watch the animals, which is something that I always think, living amongst the kept, you're really being inspired and learning about what you have within your own personal collection.
That's really cool. So basically he went from not a sterile technique, but basically bins, tubs, and then ultimately evolves to the vivariums in the bookcase with the setups to like learn and observe and watch. Sweet. So from that, obviously we get the progeny, and then those progeny are sent here, and then this zoos, pro exotics. And is that when you got your introduction to them, Rob?
Yeah, so I had seen them in that general context when they first had them, right? That was soon followed by them opening up the store. And, I had been in the area from then when they moved from Boulder down to Denver. And so going from, the big grand opening and consistently going a couple times a week, from then through the whole time. So getting exposure in that way. And then I started working there in 2002. And they still had some at that time, still had the Rhinos at that time, which had kind of come at the same time frame. I think those, similarly, Klaus had pioneered along with the Tula herpetarium folks, right? And so those were, it's not exactly clear who had the first, but Nikolai Orlov, right, at Tula, they had gotten the Russian Academy of Science animals from Tam Dao, and it was all in a similar track, so that the Rhinos were new in the U.S. in 97, 98 at that same time frame. And so I certainly was seeing them. They were not accessible to me as a kid, a teenager. The things that were $4,500 or $5,000 a reverse trio, as Matt and Chad talked about so extensively, and I know both Matt and I have some thoughts on that. But so I was seeing them from that time frame, and then getting into them from there. Possibly the first coxswain I had actually were from Fort Worth Zoo. Might have been Zoo Surplus from Fort Worth. The first ones that I had personally.
So when it comes to keeping porfs, is the way we keep them today the way that American herpetoculturalists figured out how to keep them back in the day? Or was there an evolution between today and when they first showed up? With this whole keeping. Well, let's just kind of go over their general husbandry in case there's people listening. They're like, what the hell's a porf? So that might be worth like just throwing out there into the ether.
Sure, 100%. Right. So they were, as of the original monogram, right, in 95? Is that when the monogram's from? They were a Laphae, and subsequently are Oreocryptophis, Porphyraceous, and then Coxae, Biontae, Latacintus, Pulchra, Pulcher or Pulchra, depending on, obviously, some of this, the mutation is associated with the Latinized ending of the scientific name. So we have lots of gender changes between a Laphae to Oreocryptophis, right? We have a gender change that causes the endings to change. So more confusion.
Which not many people understand, which creates even further confusion based upon masculine versus feminine. But that might actually be for maybe a more scientific talk.
Yeah.
Really. Related to naming species.
Yeah, 100%. So bamboo rat snakes all the way from India through Nepal up through Southeast Asia, through Vietnam, up into China. And they're, I think the big issue that we've seen with these, right, is that a lot of our initial exposure to these was based on a very limited data set of information. And I think a lot of things that were taken to be firmly conclusive were probably wrongly so because of the limited universe of information we had, or it coming second or third hand. So I think Klaus, right, had exposure to being there and seeing things, but a lot of anyone downstream from that, right, is taking it secondhand. And he did as to your initial question about keeping them in captivity, I feel like he was very open with his information, because I know even, Robin and Chad, it wasn't necessarily that they were intuiting how to keep these successfully, but rather it was Klaus being open with what was working at that point in time in terms of saying, yeah, keep these cooler. And then they, much to their credit, were kind of taking that and running with it, saying, okay, we're living in a very temperate but volatile climate. Let's try and maximize what he's saying and take that to really be true and see what we can do.
Very cool. So when it comes to the actual husbandry then, and this is for both of you, I feel like I'm kind of interviewing you both because Matt's part of this, Oreo Cryptophis world as well. And all I have is a pair of Palcher. That's it. So, anyways, standard operating procedure care for this group of snakes. Racks are oftentimes utilized. Heat or no heat. Like ambience, or keep them at 82 during the day and drop them down to 75, or is like 82 a death sentence? And I know we just got done bitching about care sheets. I'm not like promoting a care sheet here. I'm just trying to get gross generalities out there on the table. So
yeah, I think
on that one.
To me, and I'll be curious what Matt says. To me, that's a little bit overstated. I find them to be room temperature critters that you would do well to offer a limited access into the low or even mid 80s. I don't find that to be problematic. And heck, I lived in Michigan and had a poorly insulated basement. And so, obviously you're getting pretty hot and humid in that context in the midsummer, and didn't find them to be as sensitive as people generally think. I think if you're artificially heating them, substantially heating them over most of the cage, that probably can easily go downhill. And heck, you could certainly cook one in a deli cup, have it in the back seat of the car. There's no question about that. But if you're generally just maintaining them, I think room temp, in the same way you almost would keep anything as a singular pet snake, you could probably do okay. They, depending on your ambient humidity, you probably don't want to keep them on something that actually will actively suck moisture from them, like aspen in a place that has 20% relative humidity. That's probably a problem. But you could keep them even in those conditions on paper. Maybe their skin condition is going to suggest that you would do well to add a little sphagnum box that moist not damp, or moist not sopping wet sphagnum box to use if they want. But I think generally speaking, they're pretty forgiving captives, and really they have as we talked about, they have explosive reproduction. It's in many ways it reminds me actually of stuff that I see with people keeping dwarf monitors. That often they're one of those things that we'll see around and available, but it's probably from a small handful of people that are doing really, really, really well with them. And then they're sort of being sold on and down the line. And that's not to suggest that they're hard, but it is to say that if you have them really dialed in and your conditions do well for them, then they have the capacity to produce in a way that you almost wouldn't believe, something that would mimic like a Pueblin's milk snake, sort of the reputation we see there, where literally you can have females that grow and lay completely healthy fertile clutches before they're a year old. Alternatively, if you're particularly on coxseye, I find that the coxseye, maybe Latacintus to be true, but less so. Vionti are just a slower. They're not at that pace, but the coxseye are at that pace. Latacintus a little bit, probably a step down, but in a similar vein. I've only had Pulcher at Pro Exotics. The funny thing to me about those snakes is that and Matt will attest to this, from the mid 90s, other than porphy, which is kind of taken as meaning the form from India. Those things were the last thing to become available, right? At least amongst the stuff that's available now. Those were the last to the party. They were very expensive. Come to 2008, Matt? 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
Those were imported for the first time. From, I think Klaus sent those to Cameron, right? And they were $4,500 a pair or something. Something. They were a lot.
I think they were more than 4,500.
Yeah,
I think they were like close to $6,000 a pair.
They were. It was 50, maybe 5,500, something like that. Yeah, they were a lot. And now those are the ones you can be in a spot where Zach, you're sitting there saying, "Oh, the only ones I have are these," and those were for almost 15 to 20 years of porphyria in the United States. Those were the ones. Again, beyond porphy, we can get into whether those actually exist or whether they're the same as pulchra, locality pulchra. But ignoring that question, those were the last thing to come available. So those were the ones. All the ones that Klaus sent, those things, man, they don't hesitate to bite the hand that's holding them, which is a relatively rare feature particularly in a rat snake.
Yeah, talking about care and the nature of these animals in terms of relative keeping, I do think that part of the issue with keeping them is related to the respective humidity, bedding of the animal, airflow throughout the cage or rack system, and temperature. I really think in some of these aspects, we do start to keep some of these animals too warm. And that's just not even just porphyria, but just in generalities, where with the porphs, I tend to keep them at room temperature. I don't think keeping them too cool alters or degrades from their natural life. I actually think it helps with them, because I think what ends up happening is we start to kill sperm as well as their breeding behavior or cycle relative to that. As keeping them a little bit cooler, I think it's better because they'll seek out warmer temperatures if necessary. So I tend to keep mine at room temperature. I do offer, heat, but the thermostat is set at 77 degrees. So relative to that temperature, it's available, but are they utilizing it? Not so much. Where I think if we keep an animal, and this is just natural behavior and watching animals, if we keep an animal at a constant temperature and don't offer behavior or aspects for that animal to escape those temperatures and move from cooler to warmer, we limit that animal in terms of their natural behavior. Okay. And by having them just in a warm spot, that animal can't escape, and resultantly, we could be killing the sperm of a male, and could also be part of the reason why we don't see more porphyria. Because in 2012, memory serves me correct, I produced 600 cocci in that season. Jesus God. And I would imagine all those animals have sold, we would see more cocci. But we don't. And those animals were all sold, purchased. So where did they go? Like Rob said, I don't find them to be a difficult species to keep. But if we are limiting the availability to the Cosmic Octopus of natural resources, and they don't have those escapes, we really are limiting not only our keeping skill, but we're also limiting our growth in the hobby for knowledge of keeping different species, not only this particular, but other Asiatic rat snakes, montane boas, across the board. So,
yeah, 100%. I think that's totally right, Matt. I guess I'm viewing it when I say, because we're 100% on the same page. It's just a question of extremes, right? Of saying, what's my the limited basking temperature that I'm offering them, or if we have a daily fluctuation, or a seasonal even daytime high but down, a big question becomes, what's the nighttime low? What's our shift over time, right? What rate of variation are we seeing? And is that offsetting so that they can get a little warmer during the day if they can get cooler at night, right? What do we have? What's the totality of the system? I think there's something that does really well if you, in a variable system, basically, that has an option to get a cooler running variable system, so that, okay, it's never going to be oppressively hot consistently, because they are susceptible to stress, right? The thing that always I've come to see that's always makes me nervous is when people obsessively check their egg boxes, right? So they're perpetually checking them. I had a Latacintus that I happened to open up inadvertently, intentionally, but inadvertently while she was in the act of laying. And that stressful interaction of me doing that caused her to, become dystocia, become egg bound.
Yeah.
I took her into the vet clinic at the university, and because they were obviously in there, I'd considered kind of what Kathy Love had talked about, right, of aspirating the eggs down to make them more easy to palpate out. There seemed like maybe, within that time, even a very short window of time, there'd been some fixation to the tissue, the lining there. But the point would be that, I bring in the animal and I say, they have no idea what it is. And I'm saying, okay, please be very cautious with this. These are snakes that will stress easily and react very badly to that. And they take it away and they come back and say, oh yeah, we coned it and, rotated the thing around and aspirated them and pulled them out. And I was just like, well, that snake's dead. And sure enough, I took it home, and 12 hours later, the eggs were out. But I was like, well, the stress of that sounds horrific, right? And totally normative, even on a ball python, something that doesn't feel stress in that same way. So they certainly are susceptible to that, and they'll even tell you with their skin condition, and just they'll get a withered, wrinkly look to them, and just look bad and poor, and as a reflection even of seemingly psychological stress. Who's to say? But I knew that it was like, wow, okay, just in the description of what you're telling me that you did, that snake is gonna be dead. And yeah, it was dead in 12 hours. And that they then followed up as the vet check or whatever, how'd it go? And it's it was dead, as I knew that it would be.
Yeah. Oh, goodness me. So with these animals, we got all the different subspecies which we've addressed. In your experience, any dichotomies in keeping between the different taxa? Is one, I don't want to use the word easier because I don't think that's the right word here. But is there one that keep more wet, keep more dry? Are they all equally plastic in their requirements, or what's your opinions on that aspect of the care?
Yeah, to me, I don't, Matt. You might have a different feeling. To me, coxswain are the most forgiving in some way, the most sort of robust in general, and most forgiving, most likely to feed really well and do really well. The Latacintus are probably next in line there, but I guess, I would just present it as the coxswain are the most, like, if you have the conditions right, they will do fantastic. The Latacintus is probably next. So those are from Indonesia, Sumatra. And then the poultures are interesting, right? Because they're just, to me, they seem physiologically smaller than the other forms, with, kind of coxswain being the biggest. And Latacintus and Vionti are relatively similar, and poultures seem smaller. And that original batch were just all aggro. I don't know. Matt, certainly you have more experience. Maybe they're not all like that.
Well, it's interesting. When you mix all four of them together, you get like a super species, and that's like the hardiest one of all of them. But no, all joking aside. Yeah. But no, I agree with Rob here. I mean, coxswain in generalities are one of the more forgiving. And I think part of that has to do with their natural history and where they're found relative to temperature and climate. Latacintus are fairly similar as well. The Chinese Pultra and Pultra and Volanti are a little bit different. And I say that because you'll typically see the animals go off feed, and Volanti especially will require a brumation period to actually breed successfully, where the other three do not require that. And even if you look at their natural ranges, it should make sense why Latacintus and Coxeye don't require that.
Yeah.
Where I've made those comments on some of the Facebook boards relative to the Coxeye and things like that is you don't need to cool them. They'll breed year round because if you look at their distribution, they don't see the extremes of what Volanti and Pulcher would encounter. And this kind of goes back to the aspect of care sheets and generalities in terms of keeping some of these animals is knowing and learning about their natural history and ranges of where they're found can really exploit information on how to manipulate them in a captive environment.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I've noticed with the granted, limited experience, so I represent the keeper that's just getting into them in this. But the Pulcher are definitely psychotic. I will say that. I have them set up in a Reptile Basics rack like it's at eye level. I keep putting the angry snakes are the ones that are at eye level, which is really dumb. And I mean, literally, like I'm 6'2", and I got them stacked on top of each other, and I'll pull out that rack, and the damn snakes will they come out and they're ready to go, and you need to dangle the small adult mouse, and it's like bam, 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 and then they'll grab it, and they do this crazy like half-hearted constriction thing, but I'm almost feel like it's just doing it to cause pain, like because they'll drop the mouse and then go back, and then they're right back out there before I can close the tub, and I got to do this dance with mine, and I actually like that. Like that's not something makes me think they're bad. It's just they've been very interesting to keep. Mine don't drop feed either. I don't know if that's something or just the individuals I have. I have to if I drop feed, I pull the tub open the next day with granted sample size 2. The mice are almost always in there. I have to do the literal antagonize, get them to hit the damn mouse 2 or 3 times, and usually by about the 4th time, they bite it, do the chomp thing, and then food, and then they'll gobble it down. So when it comes to feeding them, do I have broken porphyracia, or is that kind of par for the course? Granted, I think I'm dealing with the exception, but I don't know. So,
Zach, you must not have any dogs, do you?
Well, I don't have dogs here, but I have an ancient dog that's barely alive. So
yeah, I was going to say I play fetch with my snakes. So that's what we do.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
No, I think that's and Matt, you'll know this even much better than I will, but to me that's Biota and Pulcher are more finicky, whereas Coxeye in particular in general are they're not lunatics, right? They have a focus to what they're doing and generally will eat pretty well. I think the whole group probably is sort of would favor sort of a live nesting sort of situation. So if you had a whole handful of live peach fuzzies that you left in there, I think you probably would find a different result as to whether they're still in there. But in general, Coxeye are very easy to feed off tongs, but and Latacintus more or less too, in my experience. But Viantai and Pulcher were, I don't think yours are weird. I think maybe you just have the not ideal starter, which is again funny that those are the ones that are now around.
Yeah, no, that's
I agree with Rob, especially on the nest raider aspect. It's cool. Interesting when we really talk about a number of these Asiatic rat snakes, Porphyracia, Mandarinus, Conspiculatus. what I have found over the years is that they oftentimes prefer smaller prey items than which we're willing to offer, and multiples of smaller prey items. And I've even difficult feeders, and some tips and tricks and things like that. And maybe in the coming months when we start pairing up animals and start hatching things, maybe we'll do a tips and tricks of colubrids. But the nesting aspect and some things that have actually worked out very well are even taking small deli cups, similar to like a 3.5 ounce deli cup, and putting a few small prey items in a cup, and then allowing that animal to naturally, circulate the cage and find them and hunt on that too. That's as cool. Well. And that's something with some of the wild caught Porphyracea over the years, some of the animals that I've acquired from Cameron, like some of the Pultra and things like that, is some of those tricks worked out better than, using live feeders, just because that animal's natural instinct was to search and look for nests.
I never thought about that. That's kind of cool. Imitating a rodent nest. Well, it makes sense because it given their body plan, I mean, they are rat snakes, and the classic idea of rat snakes is moderate to large arboreal carnivore. I mean, they're all carnivore, but you know what I mean. But with these guys, with Oreocryptophis, it seems like, and I remember reading this in Klaus's book, that these guys are more of a fossorial on the ground, going in amongst like interstitial spaces between rocks and boulders, right down there where the rodents are nesting, almost more like our, milk snake group, like Lampropeltis triangulum or something like that. And I found triangulum before after they've raided a nest in the field, and that's crazy. One of the like wildest things ever is finding an eastern milk snake. That's our lamprey that we have around here. And you see all the lumps in it, and I like grabbed it instinctually, picked it up, and it regurgitates an entire vole family. Like literally, like one after, like just looks like little furry M&Ms coming out. But I could see that Oreocryptophis is having that exact same niche or niche. So we don't want hookers to die. So anyway, but anyway, no, that's really, really cool.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. That reading on the body plan is correct.
Cool. So when it comes to breeding, we're hearing brumate, Valanti. Other guys don't necessarily have to brumate. I didn't really brumate, giving the introductory keeper perspective. All I did was turn off heat. And I don't even know if that caused that contributed at all, but I had a rack that had they were in there, and my Madagascarophis were in the same rack, and I knew that they both could. It's not going to hurt them, but like weak brumation. But what we're hearing now, and I've seen you have conversations, Matt, online about this, which is always funny for me to watch. No brumation, like, so if we want to breed these things, kind of like my false water cobras or dipsadids in July, if they have the right body condition, go for it. Situation.
100%. It's very interesting, and this is something, I mean, Rob and I, we've talked about, and just in terms of conversations, is if the animals are healthy, they will breed. One of the biggest issues in this hobby is everyone is fixated on the weight of an animal. And I don't know where this comes from. I don't know how or why we compare these things, but I've had cockeye breed at 1 year of age and were 2.5 to 3 feet long. And I've had cockeye that have bred at 3 to 4 years. I think one of the biggest aspects in terms of breeding behavior or introductions to this is, are the animals feeding well? Do they have a good body weight? What is their overall condition? Because if you do not have one of those attributes at an optimal condition, you're setting up the animal for failure. And on top of that, when you breed animals too young, especially the first time, you're increasing the risk with the egg laying. You're also putting the male at risk because the male could have issues with prolapse as well as just feeding behavior afterwards too, because the breeding behavior increases stress on the animals. And I would even say be careful of improperly sexing Porphyracea and putting in two males together, because males will actually kill each other. And
that's interesting.
Like rip the epidermis of the animal off to death.
Whoa. Mind's blown right now. So, have you seen this? Not that you sit there and are like, all right, kill each other, but like accidentally putting them together or something to that effect?
I've done it on accident. I don't know, Rob, have you ever seen it? Or
I've seen it with rhinos. I haven't seen it with, I guess I haven't messed up any porphies on it, but yeah, certainly putting, and haven't really doubled up single, like males on a single female or something like that, where you're getting some of that responsivity to it. Certainly they're very, thigomorphic. They respond to being touched by either things or, other conspecifics. So 100% there. I think that's great stuff, that Matt was laying out there. To me, the body condition. Well, and the other thing that jumps to mind, right, is it actually reminds me again of the dwarf monitor situation where just because some of them can, like, Frank Reed is someone who's very attuned to what he's doing, right, with these specific species. It's like, oh, he's breeding, again, same exact situation where the female's laying eggs at under a year. But that's the exceptional animal. And you're talking about having a huge sample size, and this is the one that just did great from day one. And that was the case with the coxswain that I had that would be in that spot where it was just literally just super responsive and fell into that pattern. That's probably what, Matt, 5 to 10% of the ones that can be in a spot to do that. But they totally, it's they're capable of doing it. It's just it certainly wouldn't be the recommendation if you have a pair of them.
Gotcha. All right, sweet. So the infamous question for all baby colubrids, because they come out smaller than we want them to. Getting these little guys to go. When I hatched out my clutch, I had a hell of a time getting them to eat, but they did. Is this a species or with the subspecies? Is there one? I'm kind of picking up the vibe. Coxswain and Latacintus are the introductory levels, and that I was the idiot that was like, ooh, pretty, because that was literally how I made my decision and picked the hard one to get into this whole thing with. But getting them going getting them going and incubating eggs. So are these just
getting them going? I don't find them to be hard. No, compared to other things that we consider to be hard, I don't think they're hard.
Yeah.
Matt, what do you think? I don't find, coxswain love a live pink, a small live pink. Latacintus love a small live pink. Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Bionti a little bit fussier, but yeah.
Yeah, they'll all eat live readily. They all love to hunt, per se. That natural perspective. Over the years, what I have found and have heard and have talked to people is I really wonder at what stage of temperature for incubation people are keeping and monitoring or incubating eggs at, because my perspective is that we're seeing incubation at relative high temperatures, which is causing some of these animals to be a little bit more finicky in terms of starting. But I also think that relative to starting some of these different species or subspecies, if you will, on pinks, I think the aspect is, after acquiring a new animal, most people will get the animal shipped, and that creates stress. And obviously we want that animal to then get acclimated to its new environment. And after that acclimation period, the animal starts to feed readily. It's interesting in conversation, especially with a number of new keepers, is, they may have acquired a snake right away, and immediately after acquisition, like 24 hours, they're trying to feed the animal, which also induces stress on the animal because they're not in tune with their environment, which can either further create other psychological stress to that animal too as well. So the hard part is like feeding animals and starting animals and acquiring new animals. Yeah, I mean there's so many variables that go into this. And Rob, I mean, definitely, preach the prayer here, man, because as well as I do. I mean, a lot of this stuff unfortunately gets misidentified or reviewed in different manners where we make things more complicated than what they are.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I totally agree.
Crazy. So, final thing we'll talk about, and then we'll wrap this whole thing up. This has been a fun one. Is today's Oreo just because it says it's Pulcher doesn't mean it's Pulcher. So, with all this being said, do we want to talk about purity? Like what's out there now? I mean, I go to my local show and I'll see these. They're almost always one-offs. It's kind of strange. I'm not talking about Tinley or a bigger show. I'm just talking about local shows around the country. And I would
talk about every show.
Every show. Okay, cool. So let's like hit this nail just like straight on the head. Since you guys both have copious amounts of experience, what's your opinion on that? If I'm buying a Pulcher off a random table, what do I need? What's the likelihood of that actually being Pulcher? Especially since I just found out that like 12, 13 years ago, that snake was $4,500. And when I got mine way back in the day, I think they were like $200. Like, that was it.
Hey, Rob, before you answer, I'm going to let you go first, but this is Zach's big push for a graduate student. So if you weren't listening at the first 10 to 15 minutes, he has a research project available, and Rob, you can answer.
So I would say that I think in general, maybe the Pulcher, right? The wild stuff was coming in, and there was some captive hatch stuff that came in. Latacintus, maybe there was some captive hatch stuff from 10 years or so ago, 10 to 12, 15 years ago, that we started seeing. To me, Coxeye, unless you're buying them from Matt, I wouldn't trust it, particularly if they look weird at all, if they're not solid racing stripe on a kind of fire engine red critter. Biontai have always seemed more legitimate, though. It's much less clear whether you're talking about Chinese or Vietnamese animals. But those, for the most part, it doesn't seem like those have been in the mix nearly as much. I would say that the ones that I'd be most concerned about are Coxeye, as to whether they actually are what they're proclaimed to be. And if they look weird at all, then if they look weird at all, or much worse, if you get 2 or 3 or 4 years down the track and they start throwing stuff that looks weird at all, that would give me a lot of pause.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Rob here on a number of these aspects, because even 8 years ago, I think that was probably the last shipment Cameron had brought in from China, maybe nine years ago. The Pultra and Volantai, I acquired a number of them because it's a numbers game, especially with wild caught species. And there are misrepresentations in the hobby, and I think what has happened is people have bred for intellectual curiosities themselves, wondering, what happens when I breed this to this? What does the animal look like? Because at the species level, right? I mean, when we think of Porphyracia, I mean, yes, can they breed together? Yes. But should we do this is kind of a moral or ethical question. But even more so, I think what the hard part is now, presently, and the issue that we're facing is the moral encompass, but also the financial gain that the hobby alludes itself to. And what I think we've seen is people paid an outrageous amount of money for some of these integrades that were available. And then now, as a current, locality is of interest, purity is of interest, and the problem is when you start to put a financial number on an animal, just because that is what people are advertising or saying doesn't mean that's actually being represented properly. And I say that because when you look, and if you do research, all this information is publicly available. How is it that someone can publicly offer animals 6 months before as Volanti Poultrer crosses, and then in 6 months, now they're pure Volanti or pure Poultrer? So what happened in 6 months that created this genetic change, if you will, or representation? And this, to me, is kind of a moral encompassing issue of just, it is a hobby. If this is what you want to do in terms of crossing them, you just need to be honest. Because what happens is you have people that want to keep these lines pure, and we want to keep those lines pure for future generations going forward. And misrepresenting those animals creates further complication in the hobby itself.
Gotcha.
Yeah, 100%. And it reminds, we see this all the time in the Morelia stuff, all these different communities. And for a long time, right, it was sort of defended with the position that, well, I'm honestly representing what I'm doing. Well, here's the thing. You can look back on Mexicana complex stuff in the 1980s, and a lot of people were, maybe they were honestly representing those things. If you don't have a very specific individual and lineage and sort of tracking that relationship, you can't trust a theri, that it's purely a theri. You cannot, because it's been, 35, 40 years at this point, and absent a few very specific exceptions, if I see something labeled as a theri on a random table at a show, I have no faith at all that that's true. And that, I think that's the aspect, the longevity to some of this stuff. I think we underestimate that, or people who are willing to make those, to cross those boundaries and say, oh, but I'll be honest about what I'm doing. And hey, the guy who bought it from me said he'll be on it. Sure. But 30 years is a long time, and a lot of time to lose track of what's what and whether you can really have confidence in that. And you can argue that the whole thing doesn't matter, right? That there are snakes in boxes and that it doesn't matter. And that's totally fine. But if you want to have respect for that, if you acknowledge the other side of that argument, then fundamentally one denies the other the right to exist, right? That's the hard part about saying, oh yeah, well I'm you do you, is that it's like, sure, but going forward, if there are no new inputs to the system, you actually are making it less and less feasible for someone to have the alternate view.
No, well, you're literally making it impossible biologically to have the purity if you only have X amount of founding stock or X amount of genetic, independence, and then you muddy that water with mixing. You'll never have homozygosity. You're going to have permanent heterozygosity. That's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah. Well, and there's, it's so interesting is you can, to the watchful and experienced eye, you can easily identify when you have crosses. I posted pictures a while back, and, some of this stuff has been spread out, but as a gift, someone had given me an animal that was 4th or 5th generation in lineage, but had all 4 subspecies included. So Coxeye, Latacintus, Pultra, Volanti, and they just kept crossing it and crossing it. And it was very interesting to observe, photograph, keep for a while, but I had no personal binds of wanting to continue with that.
Yeah.
Because, things that distinguish or phenotypically identify these animals, I mean, even with pure Coxeye, this gets commonly asked is like, how do I determine if this animal is pure, blah, blah, blah. And you can tell when you start to cross these different subspecies, because if the Coxeye do not have just pure dorsal stripes and they start to have banding, if that banding exceeds those stripes, then the animal is very unlikely to be pure. And you start to see this representation not only there, but you see it in the head structure. You see it in some of the features, even the coloration of the animal, because there are different shades of the red or orange representation in these different subspecies. And to the careful eye, you can start to see pattern differentiation in Latacinctus or Pulcher when they start to be influenced by other subspecies. And there are a lot of questions. And unfortunately, I think part of it is just convoluted now in the hobby and the representation, just based on, well, what happens when you start to cross these subspecies and then start to breed them back to other things? You're going to start to bring out some of those characteristics similar to, the corn Honduran crosses. You are going to bring out some of those different characteristics. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard point. I mean, morally and ethically, to the future of our hobby. And I think it even more so brings towards the fact of honesty.
Yeah.
I mean, more or less,
Well, damn. I feel like that's a good place to end it. Be honest, people. There you go. All right, cool. Well, yeah. I think we covered everything with the porfs. Rob, anything else you want to add?
No, thank you guys for having me. I think it was fantastic and great chatting about it. It's probably the most porf-specific content that there is on a podcast, as far as I know. And there's even more we can chat about in the future, but I think that's a good stopping point for now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on. If people want to find you, how do you recommend they do that?
My website that I'm sort of in the process of updating or fully modifying to be more about field herping photos and things is highplanesherp.com or rhinorats.com. Go to the same place, and High Plains Herp on Instagram.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic. And I will continue to preach the good gospel of the Cosmic Octopus. So
fabulous.
There we go. So, you can find me at Dr. Crawdad on Instagram, Zach Loafman on Facebook, and then you can always reach out to me professionally through my email, zloafman@westliberty.edu. And if you made it this far, potential grad students, reach out. Seriously. Lots to do, and I want to do it. So it's always a good time to begin, and right now is the time to start. So please do that. And then, Matt, where can they find you at?
You can find me at Serpamitra on Facebook and Serpamitra USA on Instagram, or email me at matt@serpamitra.com.
All righty. I hope you're not driving thousands of miles across Indiana next week. Maybe life can settle down a bit for you.
I'm going to Michigan next week.
Oh, okay, never mind. All righty. Okay, well, this has been another episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. We're proud to be part of the Morelia Python Network. And with that, have a great one.